Hi, this is Jared. This is my learning mind map. So, learning influences our behavior and in turn frames the way in which we respond to the world around us. So, with that said, we're going to start up in this top left-hand corner. So, there's two types of learning to start with. We're going to look at instinctual and reflex. Instinctual, if you think of our brain as a computer, it's kind of like the preloaded software to perform certain tasks. So we're going to have an instinctual ability to seek out food, water, and shelter. And then our second sort of like learning style is via reflex. And this calls on sensorial memory somewhat because as our senses process the world around us, they are going to keep us safe from danger. One of the prime examples, that's why I've included the frame here, is with a hot pan. We'll learn through experience that, heat is dangerous for our skin. Therefore, if we go to grab for our hot pot handle, we will pull back, and that's like a natural reflex to that presented stimuli. So that's why I've included the graphics just below here. So we'll scroll down and see those quickly. So survival, usually it's like, avoiding pain for pleasure. And then it's a fight or flight mechanism. And I think it really plays on those two parameters of how we learn different things. Another way in which we learn is through habitation, so habitual exposure to stimuli. And this was made famous by Eric Kandel's snails observations. So the snail gills, a vulnerable place on the body, Kandel would poke them and then they would reflex out of a bit of they would retract in natural reflex in that presentation. So their mind is already processing that stimuli. Is it dangerous? Is it not? And then Eric would poke them again and again and again. And after they've perceived that that poking is not a threat, they've learned through that stimuli that they can lessen that reflex of their gills retracting with the poking. So this is a form of associated learning. Another concept is conditioning. So we'll move over to this corner of the map and talk about Pavlov and his famous dogs. Pavlov noticed that the dogs would salivate around mealtime. So that's kind of like an instinctual behavior. And then he wanted to be able to manipulate that. So he was given an external stimuli of a bell ringing at dinner time. Once he was conditioned the dogs long enough, he would ring the bell without presenting the meal and then notice that they were salivating. So they were learning with that stimuli that the bell and the meal, the dogs would salivate. So it just goes to show how we retain information and we respond to the world around us. Another play on what I mentioned before is how learning frames our survival. This gentleman here, B.F. Skinner, he kind of stood on the shoulders of another experiment by Thorndike in which they were putting like cats or animals in cages, and then there was a lever device in which the animal would have to learn to trigger that lever and then could escape the cage and get like a food reward. So they were looking at how reward influences our behavior, and this demonstrated like the cat was able to learn to push on that lever for its outcome. As we move on through the map here, we're going to just briefly touch on how the brain processes all this information and how we learn it. The brain, as complex as it is, we'll just touch on a couple of things. The hippocampus is a part of the brain which is going to store memory, which I think intertwines with learning. The hippocampus, that's the part of the brain that retains short and long-term memory. So we sort of give it all this information. We either retain it or we deem it unnecessary and put it to the side. And that all happens in this part of the brain. This is all aided by our neurons. So they're sending different signals around the brain to sort of say, yep, everything's safe or not, danger, retreat. I think it's also interesting to mention the nature versus nurture debate because that can be influential on how all this operates as well. You know, it's a big debate within the psychology realm. So how our environment therefore influences our learning ability. One thing worth mentioning, I thought was a good way to sort of like frame this map as well was Jean Piaget, sorry, his concepts around cognitive development. So it's one thing to have all these stimuli from the world around us, but it's another thing to understand how our brains are developing to process that information. So he came up with like 4 parameters for infants to demonstrate how the brain perceives different information. We'll just use the 2 extremes. So the first stage here that he came up with was sensory motor from 0 to 2. Our brain, brand new, fresh out of the box, it is still growing. So a lot of the lobes haven't fully developed. So we're not capable of language. We're just capable of basic responses to stimuli. But then if we sort of like go through, I'll just touch on this one quickly. So in comparison, at around 12 years of age, the brain has developed to the point where it can have different internal functions. So we can hypothesize, strategize, we can plan in a different way. And prior to that, the brain was just more sort of associating like imagination, creation, things like that, where now we're starting to really develop sort of internal outcomes, and then that can influence our behavior. So, and our behavior and learning, I should say. And then we'll just finish on another parameter of learning. Observational learning is a type of a style of learning in which we view the stimuli. So we might see somebody doing something, and then our minds can sort of like process that information, and then we can replicate that through having a visual aid. Insight is another parameter of a learning style. So insight doesn't happen straight away. It's a process of learning that involves perceived solutions, not just for reward or consequence. So reward and consequence is a big influence in our behavior styles because like we often seek out reward, like I mentioned before with the fight or flight or pain or pleasure principle. Reward or consequence really frames and influences how we perceive and learn. We'll just finish off here. Another learning style is latent. Latent, I think, is best explained with an example. It's like a young child, like a young baby. It might not have the motor skills to yet use a knife and fork, but it will see its siblings or its parents doing these things. That information will be retained in the baby's mind. So once they are of age and their motor skills have developed, they've got that information in which they'll apply it to using tools like cutlery and things like that. So that's a different style of learning. One exciting thing to add to the mind map, which honestly, these things could go on forever, but that's my little mind map there. So hope you enjoyed. Thank you.